This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. In the most recent U.S. election cycle, the state of Georgia surprised many observers. First, by going for President Biden by a razor-thin majority of 12,000 votes, and then by electing not one, but two Democratic senators, who tipped the entire balance of power in the Senate, giving Democrats a razor-thin majority of 50 votes. Joe Biden was the first Democrat to carry Georgia since Bill Clinton in 1992. And the state's two senators, Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock, were the first Democrats to win Senate races there in more than 20 years. This was the result of incredible work by Stacey Abrams, who's now running for governor, and others in the state. In 2022, Senator Warnock is running for re-election against a Republican candidate who's a former NFL star, who's backed by President Trump, and who's been accused of domestic violence. We talked to Greg Bluestein of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about how these results came to be, what's likely to happen in Georgia in 2022, and what it means for the country. As a reminder, 100% of our events are recorded 100% live. Anyone who wants to can join to ask a question, share their thoughts, or listen. If you want more information about our upcoming live schedule, how to ask one of our guests a question, or how to hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live, where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Greg, before we get into all the political nitty-gritty, you have a very interesting career in journalism. You started out at the AP for 7 years, I believe, and then switched over to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in 2012. I'm wondering, what is the differences of covering politics for a big national behemoth with all those resources, and then also a state paper that is arguably one of the most respected state and local outlets in the U.S.? Is there any difference? Is it easier to cover it at one, or how should we look at this?
A huge difference. I mean, first of all, the Associated Press is a behemoth, as you mentioned, with bureaus all over the nation, but not nearly the sort of extensive coverage that you had in Georgia from local newspapers. So we were able to hit at some of the topics from a surface level, from a broader view, but the very minimum at the AP, stories went to the entire state. And most of the time we were encouraged to write for a national audience. Whereas at the paper like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, we can get into the nitty-gritty, very localized issues as well as the national issues. I can write extensively about the mayor's race in Atlanta, which is a national story as well. But I can focus on some of the issues, the parts of the mayor's races and local elections that a national audience wouldn't care as much about. And I can also hit those national themes. So there's that, and there's just a commitment to cover those statewide issues and state politics that, frankly, not just the AP, but a lot of outlets around the state and around the nation had sort of retreated from Georgia as it became this solidly Republican state, and it wasn't as interesting on a every election cycle basis. And certainly now they're all rediscovering Georgia, but luckily at the AJC we never left. We never gutted our bureaus, and we never stopped covering the issues down here, like some struggling local outlets had to do as well, because they were retreating on all fronts. So I'm not blaming them, because they were cutting back coverage of their local communities, and they weren't covering the Capitol as much. But luckily, we kind of always saw this as such an important issue to cover.
So I worked for Congress, was a legislative assistant, and worked federally in politics. And sometimes you lose the trees through the forest, or forest through the trees. So I'm wondering, based on your stint with the AJC, do you feel that you have a better grasp on the trends happening in Georgia politics now because you're more focused on the local and the nitty-gritty, or has that maybe taken away some of the focus on the national stuff, and maybe you're concerned that you're not able to kind of tap in and get a feel for the national trends that are upcoming in 2022?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's a constant struggle, the duality of our jobs, right? Is a national story, even if it's not the big local story. And I'll give you a good example. Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? I mean, I covered Marjorie Taylor Greene when she announced for Congress in the suburbs of Atlanta. She kind of broke the story to me in a coffee shop in Dunwoody, where I live. back before she was Marjorie Taylor Greene, before anyone knew her name. And then once she switched to a different district and became and started running as this unabashed, far right conservative, it was still a story for us, but it was less of a story because because it wasn't a competitive race after a little bit, and because our focus was on some other issues. So we couldn't lose our focus on her as well. But the Nationals were writing stories about every utterance she made, every controversial statement she gave, and it just wasn't doing us any good at the AJC to give a headline to every bizarre, far out there theme. And she's still doing it, right? I mean, today or yesterday, she attacked the holiday of Kwanzaa, and our stance is we're not going to write a big, huge story every time she says some provocative or some controversial, or racist or anti-Semitic thing. But that is a constant issue that we have to face because, in Georgia, for instance, like it was not a shock that Democrats were on the verge of a comeback. And it might have been surprising that they actually won, but that, it wasn't a shock that it was going to be as close as it was. But a lot of folks nationally, it was to them because they still had this perception of Georgia as this deep, deep red state. Whereas, we didn't forget 2018. And frankly, we didn't forget 2016, the fact that Hillary Clinton came so close to winning Georgia, despite spending virtually no time here and very little resources in Georgia, and still came within 5 points. So all those go into, the struggle of being the local journalist covering the national story, that we still have to keep our readers in mind, but also sometimes, have to write those sort of thumbsucker stories too, that remind a broader audience of the trends that locals, see every day.
If you had to cover all the racist statements of Marjorie Taylor Greene, it would be the Marjorie Taylor Greene Constitution and not the Atlanta Journal Constitution. So you have a new book coming out titled Flipped, How the Peach State Turns Purple. I'm from a purple state in New Hampshire, and this is kind of a thumbsucker story, as no one in this audience or even me is nearly as plugged into what's going on in Georgia as you are. You've mentioned trends from 2016 to 2018 to 2020. Is Georgia actually a purple state, or was 2020 more of this weird one-off where you had people just splitting their ticket and we probably won't see such close races moving forward?
Yeah, that's kind of the defining question of 2022. What was 2020 an anomaly, or was it the beginning of a trend? And that's something that we'll find out this year. I think it's the beginning of a trend, and I'm not saying Democrats are going to win in 2022 because I don't know, but I think that Georgia is the premier battleground state of this coming election cycle and probably the rest of the decade. And I think that Georgia will continue to be very close. I think Georgia will go more the route of Florida with very close elections than I used to say Virginia, although Virginia surprised folks outside of Virginia, at least this past election cycle. But I don't think Georgia is going solidly blue or solidly red this coming decade. I think it'll be very, very close. And I think the figures, that I read about in the book and that we're reading about and that we're talking about today, like David Perdue, like John Ossoff, Raphael Warnock, Stacey Abrams, those are the figures that are going to dominate the national scene too this decade. I mean, I'm not going to be surprised if Stacey Abrams runs for president as early as 2028. I won't be surprised if Raphael Warnock or John Ossoff are talked about as White House contenders not that far after Stacey Abrams. So I think that these figures, and look, I'll throw in David Perdue in the mix because he was looked at as a Donald Trump potential running mate, and who knows what 2024 will bring. So I wouldn't. That's the beauty of Georgia, of where we are right now, is that we really are that sort of crucial swing state, that crucial purple state. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Yeah, no, and all of those people that you mentioned, well, maybe with the exception of Purdue, are charismatic, energetic. They can hold a stump speech, and they're very interesting folks to watch, especially on the left hand side of politics. But I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into 2020, where obviously Trump lost, and then you had the two GOP Senate candidates lost their races as well. I'm wondering, from your reporting, how do GOP consultants or GOP party officials kind of view what happened in 2020? And based on your reporting, you've spoken to people across the political spectrum. You've spoken to normal, everyday citizens. Do you think the GOP has a solid grasp on what happened in 2020 and a plan to prevent that from happening in 2022?
That's a great question, because from an institutional level, the state Republican Party is pretty much ignoring the fact they lost. They came out with this sort of after-action report. There was no autopsy. It was no, here's what we did wrong, and here's how we can fix it. Instead, it basically scapegoated Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger for the election loss. It said that, it trumpeted how they never gave up on Trump. And it barely mentioned the fact that they lost the presidential race in Georgia for the first time since '92, and Senate seats and statewide states, I should say, for the first time in about 14 years. So, institutionally, we're not seeing a sort of recognition, acknowledgement from Republican leaders about these losses. And then, from the candidates themselves, like Brian Kemp, he can't go and say right now, we lost because our Senate candidates kept on having to take intensifying, escalating actions to appease Donald Trump, because he can't do anything that would risk further infuriating Donald Trump. And really neither can any party officials who are running for re-election, any top party officials. That's why you saw Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, who wrote a book about the GOP 2.0. He's not even running for a second term, because he knows it would be such a who knows if he could win or not, but it would be such a hard battle to even win the party's nomination. And that's why you're seeing Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who is running for a second term at this moment, at least, you're seeing him as a sort of a underdog, as almost an afterthought in his own race, because Trump has already endorsed a congressman who's running against him, Jody Hice. So from the party officials themselves and the institutions, you're not seeing that, hey, here's how we can win the suburbs back. You're instead seeing a sort of doubling down. There is that sort of, from the strategists that I talked to, either privately or publicly, there is that recognition, of course, that the suburbs could very well, they've already flipped Democratic, and they could go there for the next decade if the party doesn't step up. But at the same time, there's this reversion to 2018 in a way, where both parties really doubled down on driving out the base, and they said, let the middle fall where it might. And in 2018, that was done by, embracing gun rights and abortion restrictions and all these things that are very important to conservative voters, especially in rural Georgia. And I think you're going to see that being replayed in 2022. I think our legislative session that's about to start in January is going to be this brutal fight over gun expansions and critical race theory and banning certain books and libraries and revisiting abortion restrictions that have already passed Georgia. All these things that Republicans have kind of steered clear of in Georgia up until the last few years. And that's all to bring back out the base. I'm not saying they're not going to appeal to the middle too, because there'll be things like boosting education funding and bolstering public safety and crackdowns on crime that are meant to go, energize more moderate voters. So they'll still be talking about that. There'll still be an emphasis on that. But really where it's going to drive the headlines and all those other things, those cultural war issues that for better or for worse, Georgia Republicans tended to avoid over the last decade or so.
So I wanted to double down on what you just said. We're going to maybe see some more extreme versions of legislation that are more palatable to the GOP base coming up in this next legislative session. And many of the general public in the United States was focused on legislation coming out of Georgia, I believe, on voting rights. Mm-hmm. It became a firestorm. MLB withdrew the All-Star game. Delta had some comments, and I believe the state GOP legislators threatened back with some House legislation targeting Delta tax credits for getting involved in their politics. I guess moving forward, I know that this may be asking you to predict the future, but based on your conversations with corporate leaders in Georgia, do you see any future corporate, I don't want to say activism, but a corporate stance on some of these maybe more nationally controversial piece of legislations like banning abortion or whatever have you may come out of the House to fuel the GOP base? Or did the GOP pushback against these companies, threatening legislation, threatening tax write-offs, sufficiently essentially cancel and quiet down corporate criticism moving forward in the state?
I just did this piece on like the biggest questions of 2022, and I got up to like 1,600 words, and I wish I had added a couple more hundred words on this question, because it's corporations in Georgia had been quietly behind the scenes on some of the biggest issues, and we're dating back to civil rights era, right? I mean, Atlanta is a very corporate town. And the state has always had a sort of cozy relationship with its corporate leaders, even if not with the city itself. Sometimes, and corporate leaders really went out and started opposing this legislation called Religious Liberty Bill that they saw as discriminatory, and not just corporations, but leading civil rights groups and LGBTQ groups all opposed this, and there were threats of boycotts and other economic payback in 2016. And the governor at the time, Nathan Deal, who is establishment, but not supremely conservative, but a fairly conservative Republican governor, vetoed that legislation. And it was one of the rare times where corporate Georgia really spoke out almost in unison. And when it comes to abortion, when it comes to other issues over the years, there has not been that sort of pushback. Corporations actually stayed out of the abortion fight in Georgia in 2019 when the state passed some of the strictest abortion limits in the nation. Usually corporations will talk about economic reputational issues, and they'll talk about tax issues, infrastructure issues, things like that. But haven't waded into all these cultural fights like they have in some other states. Well, voting became the new litmus test, because when the Georgia legislature adopted new restrictions on voting, a whole rewrite, but they included restrictions, including new limits on ballot drop boxes and new deadlines, stricter deadlines for absentee voting and photo ID requirements for mail-in ballots, and a number of other changes. Most corporations stayed quiet, but about a few hours before the final gavel of the legislative session, both Coca-Cola and Delta spoke out against it, and it really ticked off the Republican leadership to the point where, and this does not happen in Georgia, the Speaker of the House actually cracked open a Pepsi in public. I mean, that was like,
oh boy, them fighting words.
Yeah, exactly. And you had lawmakers who publicly made a big deal about throwing out their free supply of Coca-Cola products in their office. And as a guy, I'm a lifelong Georgian. I don't think I've ever purposely sipped a Pepsi in my life. So this was like shocking. This is betrayal, really. That is seen as betrayal by many. Like, I can't believe it. It's one thing to be mad at Coke, but to drink Pepsi, oh my goodness. So that's the backdrop of where they're coming in. I think that behind the scenes, the tensions have been soothed a little bit. And I think also, frankly, as more information has come out about these voting laws, which are certainly new obstacles to the ballot box, but also, but even Democrats have acknowledged, for instance, like having a photo ID and an absentee to vote by absentee was something that many Democrats in Georgia had also supported. So, there's still some very raw feelings about that, but I think they've subsided a little bit. So we have not heard Coke or Delta go back on that sort of attack mode. Do I think there will be some repercussions, though? Yeah, I don't think there will be some, very overt maneuvering to undercut Delta or Coke. They're the biggest. I mean, Delta is the biggest private employer in Georgia. But I do think there'll be some sort of, swipe at Delta that I can't predict right now. But I think once it happens, we'll be able to say, oh, that's Delta, lost its seat at the table for that debate.
It's fascinating. We had Rich Lowry on the show, editor of National Review, and he was saying basically he supports this stuff because culture wars are the best aspect of Republican politics right now. And that kind of highlights this is all culture war stuff. I want to get into Stacey Abrams now, Greg, and help me understand this. She's a lightning rod for many in the GOP, and they cite her claims of fraud around the 2018 election that she lost. As you mentioned earlier, you touched on Secretary Raffensperger. In a March 2021 USA Today op-ed citing the 2018 polls, he's quoted as saying, Abrams' refusal to concede and her dogmatic conviction that her election was stolen had done significant damage to trust and election integrity in Georgia. Now, personally, and this show is not drawing any false equivalency between her and former President Trump, as Trump literally inspired a terrorist insurrection and an attack on our Capitol with his big lie in his campaign trying to incite this violence, in my opinion. But for us who maybe haven't really followed this, can you explain her initial claims to us, and more so, how we should look at the GOP critiques? Are they legitimate, or is this just more partisan stuff playing on, our more base instincts as a voter?
Yeah, and this is going to be an important question and issue for 2022 because Republicans will continue to try to pin the blame on Stacey Abrams for some of these, for basically they're trying to equate her with the Trump-inspired election fraud lies. And there's some huge differences. First off, right, Stacey Abrams did not concede the election to Brian Kemp. That is very well established, right? She said she essentially gave a non-concession speech 10 days after the election. But she ended her campaign and she acknowledged that Brian Kemp was the winner. That's the first big difference, right? She acknowledged that the other guy won. And that she was not going to the governor's mansion to take power. She also filed a range of lawsuits both during and after that period of I always call it like the 10 days of limbo. But they were not aimed at undercutting the election results or invalidating millions of Georgia voters like some of the pro-Trump lawsuits we saw a couple years later. These were aimed at clearing up which provisional and absentee ballots should be counted. There was questions about signature reviews that were being too harshly done. I mean, too scrutinizing maybe is the best word in some suburban counties that favored Stacey Abrams. So there was questions about thousands of hundreds or even thousands of ballots that were being improperly tossed out. There was also deep frustrations from Republicans and from some Democrats who were worried that long limbo was raising concerns about the legitimacy of Brian Kemp's victory, because even as this legal battle was going on, it didn't look like there was any way that Stacey Abrams could cover that gap. I mean, she was down by about 55,000 votes, and I think I can't do the math in my head because I'm bad at math, but it was more like 30 or so thousand votes to get to a runoff. And the only the outstanding cases we were looking at maybe involved a few thousand votes. So it was going to be very tough for her, even if she had won all those, to make the case that she could have gotten to a runoff with Brian Kemp or bested him. But the underlying part of this is that she was trying to expand the electorate, not to restrict it. Right? She was trying to get more votes counted, and she certainly wasn't trying to undermine or invalidate votes that were counted, like Donald Trump's allies were. I mean, when they called for a special session and the legal claims they were pushing were could have opened the door to invalidating millions of Georgia votes. And that's something that you're going to hear from the David Perdue and Brian Kemp's campaigns and from the candidates themselves, that Stacey Abrams was struck the first blow at confidence in Georgia's election system. And she'll say right back, hey, very different cases, and I wanted to expand the electorate, not to try to restrict it or suppress it.
That's a very interesting distinction. And then again, I'll hit on the whole terrorist insurrection and how that was basically after a campaign. Like you said, she wasn't trying to storm the Georgia Capitol, the governor's mansion, and have the lieutenant governor hung.
And real quick, too, I mean, so really, your listeners should go back and listen to that non-concession speech, because you'll hear it, even if you live far from Georgia, you'll hear snippets of it. But it's a really it's a really interesting speech to study. And she kind of, she even mentions that, not that she knew that an insurrection would happen, but she says, no, I will not be trying to, I am not the governor. I'm not about to take up residence in the governor's mansion. And she goes into depth about why she is not conceding and about how she feels the system is flawed and that she's protesting the system. And Governor Kemp, who was at the time of the election was still the Secretary of State, whose job it was to oversee the election results. which became a giant controversy throughout the entire campaign as well.
Of course. So I wanted to, I know nobody can predict the future in politics. Stacey Abrams obviously running for governor. She's doing so in a cycle that many expect the Democrats to suffer extreme nationwide losses. I lean left now, and I expect a wipeout, at least in the House. Why is she deciding to run in this environment? And from your reporting, does she see different data in Georgia than in national trends? Because it's very odd that such a bright political star, maybe the future of the Democratic Party, would attempt to buck the national trend in such a state that, if not purple, is turning purple, according to you.
Yeah, look, there's no doubt she's taking a big risk because the climate, the Joe Biden climate here in Georgia is already souring. There's been some internal polls I've seen that show his disapproval rating, the president's disapproval rating in the mid-50s in Georgia. We have our own poll coming out sometime in January, so we'll be able to, pin that on our numbers as well. So we'll see. But of course, that's going to be a challenge. And one of the biggest differences for her and Senator Warnock, who's also up for on the ballot, is that they won't be able to run away from Washington. For decades, even when Democrats had control of Georgia's politics, you'd see Democratic statewide candidates run away from their federal counterparts, right? Run away from whoever the president was or whoever the polarizing figure in the Democratic Party leadership is. And in 2020, you saw that sort of being, and really, 2018, but really 2020 to a huge degree, you saw that abandoned. To me, that moment was when John Ossoff basically welcomed Bernie Sanders' support. And this was a candidate who in 2017, when he was running for U.S. House, did everything he could to distance himself from Nancy Pelosi, from Bernie Sanders, from any national figure, unless they were had a very moderate brand. And in 2020, running in a very different race, he embraced those liberal roots of the party. So it'll be a challenge for Stacey Abrams and for Senator Warnock. But the thing they have going for them, especially, and I'll talk about Stacey's situation, 1.2 or so million people have joined the rolls, have entered the voting rolls since 2018, since her defeat to Kemp. And of those, many of them are younger voters and voters of color who tend to support Democrats. So that's a huge thing she's got going for herself. She has consolidated Democratic support. She won't face any sort of legitimate rival, unlike in 2018 where she faced a state representative who had her own sort of, she ended up defeating that state representative, Stacey Evans. But Stacey Evans had her own sort of core an argument and more moderate beliefs that challenged Stacey Abrams. So she's got unified Democratic support behind her. She's got Washington support behind her. She's got a changing electorate. She can point to the fact that Democrats have actually done it now. For the longest time, people in the media and elsewhere, and even the Democratic candidates themselves would sometimes say, okay, we're trying to climb this mountain, and we've never got to the top. Well, now they can say in 2020 they got to the top, right? They actually won statewide races for president and for U.S. Senate for the first time in more than a decade. And of course, and this is maybe her best advantage, and this is why Georgia can't be easily compared to Virginia or some other, purple states where Democrats have had troubles, is that Republicans are still warring with each other. And I think maybe Georgia is the place where they're going to be fighting the most amongst themselves, right? You've got the David Perdue, Brian Kemp dynamic. You've got Trump endorsing in 4 statewide races and disavowing 4 other statewide elected officials who are all Republicans, right? So you've got this Trump dynamic going on, and it's continuing to divide the top. And meanwhile, as David Perdue and Brian Kemp are battering and bruising each other already, both of them have already spent a huge amount of money and resources on digital ads and TV ads and radio spots and airtime and social media time just bashing each other. Stacey Abrams is out there with a Merry Christmas ad talking about how she wants to expand healthcare and boost public health funding and school spending in Georgia. Non-controversial or largely non-controversial things that she'll kind of have to herself through at least, May or June, whenever the Republican nominee is set up. And that's a huge advantage. Doesn't mean that she won't have have all sorts of troubles next May or June when Republicans try to tie her to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden relentlessly. But for now, she can benefit from a divided GOP field that will be brutal, and that those wounds they inflict on each other will not be healed easily. It's not like in June things will, Republicans will be able to say all is well, the ends well. We're all on the same page now, because some of these will take a long time to heal.
And folks, if any of that interests you, our guest here is also an author. He's writing Flipped: How the Peach State Turned Purple, which I believe comes out in March 2022. Great primer for primary season. We'll have to have him back for a book tour as well, so we can get specifically more into the book. But I did want to hit on that other side that you've been hitting on pretty consistently here, which is David Perdue, former senator, wealthy businessman, I believe former CEO, is primarying a sitting governor in Governor Kemp. Usually these primaries, Greg, and correct me if I'm wrong, are shaped by establishment figures being challenged by an outsider status or vice versa.
Yeah.
Here we have two establishment figures in a primary duking it out. You've mentioned it and alluded to it regarding Trump, but I'm wondering, do these two white male gentlemen who are Republicans in Georgia, who both are from the establishment, actually have any substantive policy differences? Or is this all a Trump primary, and how should we view the impact of Trump on the primary?
Ooh, a policy question. I love it. So David Perdue, you mentioned he's an establishment figure, and it's hard to argue with that. But he also considers himself kind of the OG outsider, because back in 2014, when he ran for U.S. Senate, he ran against a bunch of establishment candidates. I mean, I think there was, I'm trying to remember, 3 Congress members and 1 former Secretary of State who were in that race, and he beat them all. And was kind of always sort of the underdog in that race, and had this sort of famous visage with this pop collar blue jean jacket that he wore instead of his fancy tailored suits around the campaign trail, and got a lot of mileage out of the idea that he was this outsider. And then even after 6 years in the Senate, still, like many politicians like to say, that he was still an outsider, and he's running. Even though he has 6 years in the Senate under his belt, he's still running as an outsider against Brian Kemp. And when it comes to policy, he has this advantage because he can basically say that whatever Governor Kemp is doing is not conservative enough, has not gone far enough. And that starts with Trump, right? It starts with he's criticized Kemp for not calling a special session to overturn the election results. He has criticized Kemp for certifying the election, which because the governor was bound by law to do. And he's even joined one of these conspiracy-riddled lawsuits that allege all sorts of election fraud, even though there's no basis whatsoever to any of those claims. So let's start with that. But then beyond that, there's some serious policy rifts they have. This one sounds parochial, but it's a big deal in Georgia especially. But David Perdue supports the idea of a referendum for a city of Buckhead. And to just explain that, Buckhead is the wealthiest neighborhood in Atlanta. It's about 1/5 of the population of Atlanta, but more like half of the revenue. It's where all some of the fancy malls and shops and some of the fanciest homes and mansions in Atlanta are. And there's been this movement that really sprung up a year ago to secede from the rest of the city. And it's a big legislative debate about whether or not that can even be allowed. And David Perdue came out and endorsed that idea and said he'd sign it into law if he were governor. And Governor Kemp has kind of said, not that he hasn't even leaned towards it. He's more said essentially that he understands why Buckhead residents are frustrated with the city of Atlanta, but he won't take a stand on the legislation yet. So that might be one of the biggest rifts. And then there's others. David Perdue wants to eliminate the state income tax, which is about $14 billion worth of revenue every year, has no plans to fill that gap, but still says he wants to eliminate it. So, and Brian Kemp has said, look, he supports shaving, 0.5% here or there, but not eliminating it altogether, because that again is about, that funds our entire school system. That funds roads and bridges and all these things that you can't just eliminate in one fell swoop. And then the third major thing so far is that David Perdue says that Kemp hasn't gone far. Kemp hasn't fulfilled this promise to expand gun rights. and he supports something called which definitions, but essentially says that allows people without concealed weapon permits to more easily carry their guns wherever they want. And so that's going to be a huge debate in Georgia this legislative session.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like Kemp wants to be on the side of being viewed as restricting gun rights. And then also, it looked like these polls are all crap right now, but it looked like once Perdue was endorsed by Trump, he cut a 19-point deficit to Kemp and made it even. So I guess I want you to hit on how big you think Trump plays in Georgia. Silly question, but specifically in this primary, but also regardless of whoever gets out of the primary, whether it be Kemp or Perdue, we've seen the GOP nationalize figures like AOC and Rep. Omar for statements and policies they may support. So if you're in a House race in Michigan, you'll hear the GOP candidate railing against these progressives, trying to tie that candidate to these progressives. I'm wondering, the racist in the room, quite frankly, Marjorie Taylor Greene is in the state of Georgia. Yes, she's a massive fundraiser. She's blowing records out of the water. But once these candidates get into a general election versus Stacey Abrams, the machine that she has so painstakingly set up, the Democratic national support, will it be hard for them to get away from Marjorie Taylor Greene, i.e., will Marjorie Taylor Greene play any role in the general election?
I love both those questions. Okay, first one about Trump and how he'll play. He's going to obviously play huge in the Republican primary, and no one knows that better than Brian Kemp, because there was a secret tape in 2018 that came out during the runoff between Brian Kemp and Casey Cagle, who was the favorite. He was the heavy favorite in the Republican nomination race. And I got a hold of the secret tape and reported on it, and basically it involved Casey Cagle saying all this nasty stuff about conservatives that kind of played into what the argument that Brian Kemp was trying to make about him, which was that he was this phony conservative. And so after that tape came out, Brian Kemp had a lead in the runoff against Casey Cagle, but not a huge one, single digits in most of the polls I saw. But then after Brian Kemp won Trump's endorsement, that single-digit lead turned into a blowout, and the race wasn't even close in the end of it. Brian Kemp won every county, all 159 counties in Georgia, but 2, and dominated even in Casey Cagle's hometown of Hall County, which is a bastion of conservative voters in Georgia. So both David Perdue and Brian Kemp know how important Donald Trump's endorsement can be. That's why you don't hear Brian Kemp saying one single negative word about Donald Trump, unlike some other Republican office holders who are saying it's time to move on past Trump. Governor Kemp will just say essentially, hey, he supported Donald Trump's agenda and he supports his ideas, and the two can have differences, but he supports everything that Donald Trump stands for. Even their internal polls show, even Kemp's internal polls show a neck and neck race. I think they had him 4 points up after you factor in Trump's endorsement. So to me, that's a neck and neck race. I'm sure the margin of error was about 3 or 4 for that poll, if I remember correctly. So even his rosiest outlook shows a very, very tight race. So I and a lot of the strategists that I talked to in my own analysis is this is a toss-up going into 2022, right? As 2022 dawns, the Republican race between Kemp and Perdue is unpredictable and a complete toss-up. About the Marjorie Taylor Greene part of this, it is surprising to me because I was sure, and I wrote a story about it after she won the GOP nomination, saying that basically Republicans have kind of created their own monster. And I was sure that Democrats would try to make her the face of the Republican Party in Georgia. And they really haven't as much. And they've used her to fundraise and they've used her to help energize some liberal voters. But I haven't seen this, this full-scale effort to tie Brian Kemp to Marjorie Taylor Greene. And they could, because I reported it. I did a lot of reporting about this last year, about how virtually no Republican leaders would stand up and say what Marjorie Taylor Greene was doing was wrong, and still aren't. I mean, if I went to
they aren't.
They're not. No, not at all. If I went to go poll every Georgia Republican leader today about what she said about Kwanzaa or what she said about whatever the latest controversy was, they will all, I can already guess, they will all, except for the ones who aren't running for office next year, or they'll all duck the question, or either ignore it or give some statement about how, the Republican Party needs all sorts of voices and something like that. And this was a departure because at first, when she first came on the stage, several prominent Republicans spoke out against her, including Congressman Jody Hice out in Northeast Georgia. And they've since made amends, and they're buddies, and the rest of the Republican establishment is kind of, they don't necessarily want to cozy up to her. You're not going to see Brian Kemp go out of his way to go stand next to her at a rally, but I don't think that she'd want that either. So you basically have this arm's length approach from some of the Republican leaders, and Democrats haven't quite yet. Maybe there's something going on that I haven't seen yet, but they have not effectively made her the face of the and maybe it's because it doesn't work as well with Democratic voters. I mean, we know in Georgia for the last 10 years, Nancy Pelosi has been tied to every candidate, and that our poll showed she was the most vilified Democrat in Georgia. Even some moderates and even some Democrats didn't like her because of all the maybe effective ads that were run against Nancy Pelosi inspired candidacies and things like that. And maybe it just doesn't work as well with Democrats, or maybe they just haven't found the right message. But I won't be shocked to see that sort of been revived next year.
Awesome answer. Thank you. So now we're going to go to the audience portion. I do have a question about Herschel Walker I want to try and get in before the buzzer here, but we will go to Robin for the first question, and then we will go to Greg for the second question. Robin, I believe, actually lives in Georgia and maybe one of your readers. So Robin, over to you.
Hey, Robin.
Thank you. Hi, Greg. You're the first Twitter account I check in the morning.
Okay.
Yes, I live in Atlanta. I'm a former campaign staffer for Senator John Ossoff, and I had a question regarding the Secretary of State race. If Kemp wins the Republican primary and he's their candidate for governor, do you think Trump and some of the GOP will shift some of their focus away from the governor's race and really focus on winning the Secretary of State race in order to set Trump up for a presidential run in 2024?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's going to be really interesting to see how Trump threads that needle. Because, I was at the rally in August or September in Georgia where he said he would have rather seen Stacey Abrams win the governor's race than Brian Kemp, right? I mean, if you talk about something that infuriates, I like to do those checks with Republicans every so often, like, hey, you got a comment on this? And almost no Republican leaders I talked to would dare comment on that on the record, but privately, people were just aghast and infuriated and sent me all sorts of, off the record statements and on background statements. But how, if Kemp is the nominee, what will Trump do? Because Herschel Walker will, he's the front runner. Who knows what will happen? But he could very well be the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate. So you'd imagine that Donald Trump would still want to come to Georgia and back Herschel Walker and back Jody Hice if he's the Republican nominee for Secretary of State. But how he approaches Kemp is going to be really interesting because, he'll have a rally in Georgia and Kemp wouldn't be there. And it would be for all the candidates but Kemp, I mean, you could very well see that scenario playing out. And it could be very much like we saw in the runoffs where Donald Trump had two rallies before the January 5th runoffs. And both of them, Kemp was a no-show. And one of them, right before the first one, there was a shouting match essentially between Kemp and Kemp and Trump on the phone. Where I don't know if the governor shouted, but it was more of Trump berating him for not calling that special session. And the governor's like, I've already said no. He unequivocally said no once again. So you could very well see a scenario where there's these, political rallies with Trump there and backing Herschel Walker and backing Jody Hice and backing whoever else he wants to back at that thing and not saying a single kind word about Brian Kemp and even encouraging Republicans not to vote for Brian Kemp. I mean, it's not shocking after what we saw with the former president in September, saying that he wished Stacey Abrams had won the governor's race. So that's why this story isn't going away either. That's why even after the primary or the runoff or whatever, we have a Republican slate. That's why the Trump effect isn't going to be something that the candidates try to set aside because they'll still be trying to emphasize Donald Trump's support, and Donald Trump will still want to hold rallies and events and things like that for the candidates.
And great question, Robin. Thank you very much. We will go to Greg Sattel and then Matt for a question. Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks for joining us, Greg.
Of course.
I want to get back to this issue with the corporations in Georgia. And I don't think most people realize how corporate of a city Atlanta is and how many Fortune 500 companies are there. And I think it's fair to say that what's driving a lot of those actions that they made are their employees. When I lived in Atlanta about 10 years ago, I was amazed how liberal it was and how PC liberal it was. So my question is this, is over the last 10 or 20 years, it does seem that every cycle there's at least one race where somebody where Republicans nominate somebody crazy in their primary for a governor or for senator, and they're or even for rep, and they're like a devil worshiper or a child molester or something. If you were to predict what race in Georgia that would happen this upcoming cycle, what would be the most likely race for the Republicans to nominate somebody who's a bridge too far?
Yeah, it's a great point about the corporate world in Georgia, because then that dates back to the civil rights era, where leading corporate officials and corporate leaders basically said, we don't want Atlanta turning into Birmingham. We don't want we want Atlanta to continue to be, and of course it's not perfect, and there's all sorts of issues that persist until today. But they wanted Atlanta to be a more progressive beacon of the Southeast than some of its other southern rivals, and that helped Atlanta become what it is today. Which is, yeah, you're right. There's a dozen or so Fortune 500 companies that are based either in the city or the suburbs, and those business leaders, and Ed Bastian, the CEO of Delta, talked about it. They faced enormous pressure from their employees to take a stand on not just on voting issues and things like that, but also on other issues that have come up in Georgia. They stay out of gun rights and abortion, but they will. I won't be surprised if there's other legislation this year that's restrictive. That if it moves forward in terms of voting restrictions, I will not be surprised to see a coalition of businesses come out and speak out against it, because they'll make the case that it's about democratic values, not about politics. When it comes to a bridge too far, that's a great question, because last year it was the 14th district which Marjorie Taylor Greene ended up winning. And she won a race against a local neurosurgeon who comes from generations of Northwest Georgia business owners and families. And she was literally the carpetbagger. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning of our program that she lives where I live, in the North Atlanta suburbs, and she was going to run for a less suburban Atlanta district against Democrat Lucy McBath, a congresswoman from East Cobb County. And then when the seat in 14th district came open, she moved up there and ran up there. And her opponent, John Cowan, the neurosurgeon I just mentioned, he was basically saying he was the conservative without the crazy. He was the local conservative who's going to vote conservative on every issue, but he just wasn't going to inject all sorts of, all the Marjorie Taylor Greene stuff into the race. And he got walloped. It wasn't even close. So I think the best parallel to that this cycle could well be the 10th district, which is where Jody Hice, who's running against Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger with Donald Trump's endorsement, he's vacating that Northeast Georgia seat. And there's a group of, I don't know how many it is now, it's about 10 Republicans running in the very conservative seat. So there's no chance of a Democrat winning that race at all. And they're all trying to sort of outdo each other on the right. It's not getting as much attention right now because we've got a lot of other interesting races going on. But I won't be surprised to see a very, very conservative candidate emerge from that seat and say, very galvanizing, polarizing things to try to drum up even more support. And it'll make some of the Republican leaders in Georgia all, get all stressed out and crazy, because people like me will be asking, what do you say about, candidate X from the 10th district who's saying, who's saying that he believes that, Trump should still be president or whatever. They'll have all sorts of conniptions over that. But I think that's probably the best case. But I think I wouldn't I wouldn't overlook some of our statewide races too. And I know we're already going to be focusing on the Senate race and the race for lieutenant governor and governor and all that. But the fact that Deborah Perdue is in the race for governor means that Brian Kemp's going to have to move even further to the right on policy issues. The fact that there's a very heated lieutenant governor's race means that an establishment-friendly candidate who's a Senate GOP leader in the Georgia Senate named Butch Miller, he's already taking stances far to the right, like he wants to ban ballot drop boxes. So we're seeing this effect play out in real time, in up and down the ticket. It's not just governor's race or Senate race. It is the Trump effect is having its influence down the ballot and turning establishment-friendly candidates into not so establishment-friendly candidates right before our very eyes.
And it really is those House races that are in very polarized districts that have many candidates in the primary where you can get some recipe for crazy. I say that because my former boss, Tim Huelskamp from Kansas, ran and won, I believe, on the 2010 wave. And he ultimately got primaried from the center because he was just too far crazy. How times have so changed. But we will go next. I believe I said Matt is up, and then we will go to Stephanie. Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Justin, and thank you, Greg, for all your insights. I'm going to piggyback a little off the previous question, and I was wondering when it comes to the upcoming gubernatorial races, Senate and down ballot, what are some, in your opinion, population, community groups that we should be looking at in terms of how those races could go? I've heard things about when it came to the Virginia governor's race, how there was a major swing when it came to rural, white, working-class women, or are we looking more at people who are maybe moving into Georgia from other states or new voters who weren't there back in 2018?
Great question. I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but in Georgia, the suburbs really are so important to the Democratic coalition. I live in North DeKalb. I live in DeKalb County, which is the biggest Democratic bastion in Georgia. But the part of my county I live in, up in the northern part of the county, has traditionally been kind of more in the middle. And in 2016 and 2018, it swung decisively to the left. And my neighbor, a guy named Mike Walensky, who went to high school with me, became the first Democratic representative for the city of Dunwoody, or the area of Dunwoody, because it wasn't a city until recently, but the Dunwoody area, and since Reconstruction, and so you started seeing Democrats win state legislative races in the suburbs, and you started seeing, Hillary Clinton won Gwinnett and Cobb County. She became the first Democrat to win those counties that were formerly Republican bastions since Jimmy Carter was president. And so keeping that coalition together is going to be a huge challenge for Democrats in 2022. Keeping Gwinnett County, which is is the second most populous county in Georgia, and it's become like the cornerstone for Democrats in the state. It's a county that went nearly 60% Democratic in the last election cycle, and getting back to those high levels is going to be really hard for Stacey Abrams and Senator Warnock. So I'm watching those, and of course, we always watch very closely the base of the party. The people of color who have long been, especially Black women, who have long been the foundation of the Democratic Party of Georgia, and who are going to be energized. They're going to be energized for Stacey Abrams and Senator Warnock. But we'll see to what degree. We'll see, because there's going to be efforts to go far right from Republicans to energize rural voters. In 2018, we thought that it would be impossible for some of these red counties to get even redder. I mean, we're talking about counties that went 92%. They might have gone 70% for Mitt Romney. They went 90% for Donald Trump and 92% for Brian Kemp. And these are small counties. Some of them might only have a few thousand voters, but they add up. Georgia has 159 counties. And so, in the end of 2018, it was fascinating because Brian Kemp basically, he still aired millions of dollars worth of ads in Atlanta, but he basically left the city and went to South Georgia and spent, a ton of his time on the campaign trail in rural South Georgia, appealing to those people, to get to 90%, get to 92% in some of these counties. And so, we'll be watching those rural voters too very closely. And frankly, one of the things that happened in 2018 that still probably Stacey Abrams, if you give her a truth serum, would acknowledge was one of the big missteps was that she had some gaffes near the end of the 2018 campaign that only revved up rural Georgians even more. And she corrected those gaffes. I mean, she had something about suggesting that working as a farmer wasn't as hard as working in other professions. I remember one of the gaffes she had, she fixed what she said almost as soon as she said it, but it didn't matter because Republicans had that clip. And for the next 2 or 3 weeks on the campaign trail, that's what Brian Kemp would say over and over and over again. He'd invoke that gaffe and he'd use it to rev up Republican voters. And they might not need a gaffe this time. They might not need a misstep because they can just talk about, whatever policies in Washington that is hated by conservatives. But we can't forget that in these sparsely populated counties, that huge turnout matters just as much as it does in the suburbs once you start adding all that stuff up.
Yeah, because it is truly cumulative, and 1,000 votes here and 1,000 votes there in a close election, it matters. So let's try and get 3 quick questions in here, and then we'll let Mr. Greg go. Again, author of Flipped, How the Peach State Turned Perp, coming up March 2022. So let's go to Stephanie, and then we'll go to Ben, and then we'll close out with Ab. Stephanie, over to you.
Justin, thanks for having me. And Greg, it has just been a real pleasure to kind of listen to you break these things down and kind of some of your insights. Because you're really smart people on the stage, I think we waded into some of the part of the question I was going to be asking you, but I'll try to keep it brief. Greg, how significant do you think we could see the play out between the Stacey Abrams effect? And I mean, she's a very inspirational, strong woman. We know that this last election cycle had a variety of things that it was facing that I think really helped this flip purple. But as we know, the Democrats are facing pretty strong headwinds. The COVID-19 pandemic is by no means over. Inflation is rising. And of course, Biden's approval rating is starting to tank. It's sort of been struggling. We know that Trump will have an impact. We're going to see candidates want to bring him in and certainly use that endorsement. But we also know that with some of the voter suppression legislation, obviously is a concern. How much between the Stacey Abrams effect and the Trump effect, I'm isolating these two, do you think will play into the overall sort of voter attention and drive towards these elections and in all the races? What do you see based on that question? Again, I'm trying to do a summary of all the other things we've talked about. But do you see those two components having a strong impact against each other? And if it isn't against, what key things do you think we need to be thinking about as we're watching this unfold?
Yeah, that can be really interesting if the Trump effect counteracts or helps neutralize the Stacey effect or vice versa. I mean, I know already that we can already see it coming. This thing I'm about to talk about, because the internal poll that came out for the National Republican Senatorial Committee showed basically a neck and neck race between Senator Warnock and Herschel Walker, but it showed Joe Biden's disapproval rating in Georgia at 55. So that to me was a huge clear signal that Republicans are about to step up their attacks on Warnock, trying to tie him to Joe Biden, because they're going to sink him, tie him to an unpopular figure who might even be more unpopular by this time next year, or who knows, might be less unpopular. But either way, we'll still be hated by a core of conservatives in Georgia. And how Stacey Abrams navigates that is going to be telling, because I asked her that question right after she got in the race. I mean, how are you going to play the Joe Biden issue? Are you going to embrace him, or are you going to keep him at arm's length? Or are you going to just focus on Georgia? Because in 2018, she wouldn't mention Donald Trump's name. She would say the person in the White House. She did not want to try to nationalize the race on some levels, when it came to some policies and some strategies. Whereas in 2022, it'll be hard for her to avoid Joe Biden and the souring numbers and questions about inflation, if they are still questions at this point next year, and all the other things that come along with having your party control the White House. And she said, to me, and I'm just paraphrasing, but she essentially said, I won't shy away from any president who is effectively trying to expand healthcare and spend public health dollars to fight a pandemic that is still raging and to boost our infrastructure. So she was basically highlighting the infrastructure package, the coronavirus relief package, and maybe Build Back Better if it passes. And so you'll see her continue to do that. But Stacey effect has sort of another thing that we just have to pay attention to in Georgia, which is as much as it energizes Democrats, it also has the potential of not maybe unifying Republicans, because it's hard to see Republicans unified right now, but at least galvanizing Republicans against a quote unquote common adversary, right? Against someone who they can all get on the same page of attacking. Because I think I mentioned earlier, it used to be Nancy Pelosi that was the most vilified Democrat in all these Georgia polls that we do. Well, Stacey Abrams is right up there with Nancy Pelosi now. And that's because millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars have been spent by GOP groups and candidates attacking her. And so there is this sort of this view of Stacey Abrams in the minds of Republican voters that hasn't quite got there with Warnock yet, right? Warnock is, certainly his approval ratings aren't high among Republicans, but they're not as dire as Stacey Abrams is. But if, on the counter, the flip side to that is that her numbers with independents and moderates are still very strong. And that's what she's got going for her going into this race. So I hope I answered your question because I hit on a few themes, but
no, it was great. Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Basically, Stacey's that's another reason why Stacey feels like she's in the right place to run right now, because she still is
moderates and independents.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know that. That's some good insight there. Thank you very much. So we will go, two more questions, and I have a Herschel Walker question for you. Then we will let you go. We'll go to Ben and then Ab. Ben?
Hi, Justin, and thank you, Greg. I have a question. As much as Donald Trump has pummeled Brian Kemp, he is no Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger.
No.
He is still sort of ignores it and still acts as a pro-Trump Republican. But it seems with the trending of the population in Georgia trending purple to blue, it would seem to be there would be an opportunity for a true anti-Trump Republican to become credible and to have some traction. Is there anybody on the landscape who is a true anti-Trump Republican who has a credible future or at least influence? And is there any movement within the Georgian Democratic Party or outside of the Georgian Democratic Party? Republican Party to go in that direction? Thank you.
That's a very good point about the governor, because you're right. He has not uttered a single bad word about Donald Trump in public, at least. Maybe privately he has, but in public he has not. He can't afford to, because he knows that if he tries to make this about, his analysis is if he tries to make this about Donald Trump, even more so, then it'll just turn off all the Donald Trump voters in Georgia who still have significant influence in the Republican primary. So, but your question about if there's are sort of anti-Trump candidates, there are two in Georgia who have futures that I can think of off the top of my head. One is Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, who wrote a book called GOP 2.0, who you should have on the show if you haven't already, because he's more than happy to jump on.
We will have him on.
Yeah, I've even dragged them on to Morning Joe once, right in April of this year. So he's willing to talk to all sorts of different audiences. But he wrote this book, GOP 2.0, about the future of a post-Trump Republican Party. Now, he's not up for election. He decided against running for a second term, and Trump has already endorsed one of his would-be successors. But he is someone who's going to continue to play a role in Georgia politics in the future, and has even toured battleground states, presidential battleground states. And he was recently in South Carolina and up in New Hampshire a few weeks ago. So I'm not saying he's going to run for president or VP, but he is pushing his message on a national scale. And I wouldn't be shocked to see him in the Georgia mix in 2026 or 2024 or down the road. But the other one who is on the ballot is Brad Raffensperger. And we talked about him earlier, but he is someone who is very, very outspoken about the election fraud lies from Trump, and has said that Trump was the author of his own defeat by denigrating mail-in ballots, because tens of thousands of reliable Republican voters who voted for Trump did not vote. Sorry, voted in the presidential primary, did not vote in the November election, and then tens of thousands more voters did not vote in the Senate runoffs. So he's been very outspoken about the Trump lies, and as we said earlier, falsely equated them with Stacey Abrams as well. But the very fact that he's out there facing election and very vocally refused Trump's demands in that phone call to overturn the election results sets him diametrically opposed to the former president. And the former president has made it very clear that he wants nothing more than Brad Raffensperger to also join the ranks of defeated Republicans in Georgia. And that's why he is, how many down ticket statewide candidates has Donald Trump endorsed? Not many, but one of them was Jody Heiss, who's running against Brad Raffensperger. And that was the first, Republican who in Georgia, statewide candidate who Donald Trump endorsed, who was actually in the race. So that tells you a lot about where Trump's mind is and how he views Brad Raffensperger.
Fantastic question, Ben. Our last question is going to go to Ab, and then I'm going to ask about Georgia former football player, historic college football player, Herschel Walker. Ab, over to you.
Thank you, Justin. Greg, this has been a great conversation, so thank you for joining us. So my question, or more so my curiosity, is really about, what trajectory or where does Stacey Abrams see herself in terms of her political career? Because is her going into running for governor again more so her emphasizing her focus strictly on Georgia politics and Georgia politics alone, or does she have any possible ambitions for national elections, or is that something that she's just not really interested in? Thank you.
Yeah. And that's a great point. And it's something that I know I say this with all the questions because they're such good questions, but she's made it very clear. Two things. One is that if she wins the governor's race, she will not be running for president in 2024. So she that was something that was part of my first story, that she was running for governor earlier this month. It was in the, 6 or 7 paragraph, which was her campaign said flat out she was not running for president in 2024. And the reason why we have to write that is because that is going to be an attack throughout the campaign, that she just wants to use this as a stepping stone to the White House. And frankly, it's part of the reason why it's going to be attacked is because she has been very outspoken about that. And she feels like she should be outspoken about that because she wants to be a model for other young Black women to want to embrace, the possibilities of running for president. So unlike other potential VP candidates, let's say in 2020, she was not quiet about or shy about at all acknowledging that she wanted to be Joe Biden's running mate. This famous story in Georgia politics, but she has a spreadsheet that she made when she was 18 that charted her political climb up the ladder. And it started with her being Atlanta mayor and then governor and then president. And when asked about that, she acknowledges every single time, she wants to be president one day. She wants to run for president one day. But that doesn't mean she wants to forego the opportunity to run for governor, obviously, right? And so I fully expect her, and I might, her ambitions might change and things could happen, but I fully expect her to run for president, down the line, especially if she wins the race for governor in Georgia. But even if she loses, you never can. We have all learned in Georgia, Republicans, Democrats, reporters, whoever, never to count Stacey Abrams out of anything. And she is truly a candidate who, after she lost in 2018, became even more well-known on the national stage, which is why we're talking about her right now. And frankly, I went out and I'd go to events of hers all over the country. And I went to an event with hers in San Antonio, the start of it wasn't even a book tour. It was just a conversation series in San Antonio, Texas. And I showed up, maybe an hour early, packed, sold out. And this was in the middle of San Antonio. And I guess I shouldn't have been shocked, but I guess I was. And she had, she commands a huge crowd wherever she goes and has a national audience. And if she wins the governor of Georgia, she'll be able to push some of these, some of her policy agendas items and say that she helped bring certain policies to a formerly red state. And I think even if she loses, she could still try to parlay that into a run for higher office. So I don't know what her timing is, but I do know that she said very clearly, unequivocally, it will not be 2024, because she also knows that is already becoming a campaign attack. And it doesn't matter how often she says it; it'll still be a campaign attack for Republicans who will say that she wants to use this to run in 2024. But also, she feels like she shouldn't be punished for speaking her truth, which is she wants to run for higher office one day. She wants to run for president one day. And she was pressured to run for Senate in the last cycle. And obviously it worked out fine for Democrats with John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock both winning those seats. But she was under immense pressure and went the other way and said, basically, I don't see myself as a senator. I see myself in the executive branch. And that, to me, was yet another clue that, ultimately, we might be talking about 2040. We might be talking way in the future. And ultimately, I won't be shocked if she runs for president.
I love when a politician, Republican or Democrat, owns their ambitions, because so often they run away from them, and it's bullshit. Pardon my French. So we've run over, but I do have one last question for you. We've heard of Teflon Don. Donald Trump has been accused of some awful things. So has Herschel Walker. I don't know about the lawsuits and litigations, but I'm wondering, he was a college superstar. College football is huge in Georgia. He has this celebrity gravitas, or I assume he does, in the state of Georgia. Is that enough for him to be able to weather the criticisms about the allegations, I believe, of domestic abuse and other heinous things? And do you believe, since we're ending the year with this show, looking into the future, do you believe that celebrity will now minimize character issues in politics in Georgia, but maybe also nationally?
I'm honored to be the last show of the year. I didn't realize I had that unique honor. So that's great. Now, when it comes to Herschel Walker being Teflon Herschel, that might be the truth for the Republican race. The internal polls I've seen show him with a very large lead over his lesser known rivals. And maybe the biggest name that also got in the Republican race was the agricultural commissioner. So basically, who's won statewide office multiple times. So he's no slouch, but he's not a big name contender like Kelly Loeffler or David Perdue or others who are initially seen as potential candidates for that seat. Now, Herschel has huge name recognition in Georgia, to the extent that he got in the race. One of our sports columnists wrote this story about why Herschel was such a phenomenal athlete. Like, it's not just the fact that, he powered Georgia's 1980 national championship victory. But beyond that, he's an Olympian and he's a mixed martial artist and, a storied athlete. But yeah, beyond that, is it enough? It could be enough to win the Republican primary. But in a general election where Democrats kind of take the gloves off and fight back, because right now we haven't heard, I don't think we've even heard Senator Warnock mention Herschel Walker's name. It's something he just kind of says, I'll beat whoever they put forward. But in a one-on-one matchup between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock, the gloves will come off, and we'll see we'll see Democrats bring to the forefront some of the issues that not the Republicans are skating around them, because Gary Black has been speaking in very harsh terms, saying essentially that all these issues that have come up have disqualified Herschel Walker as a legitimate contender. But mainly his argument is basically that Herschel Walker will lose to Raphael Warnock. Once basically a party puts money behind this and gets it out to the general public in a much more slicing and cutting way. That is maybe another giant question for 2022 is whether or not, if Herschel does win the nomination, whether or not his celebrity will carry over. And in general, yeah, you mentioned, we've seen celebrity candidates in other states, but generally some of those states, at least like Alabama, there's not a truly competitive general election campaign, whereas in Georgia there will be. And I mentioned Gary Black's no slouch. Well, Senator Warnock is certainly no slouch. He is already one of the foremost Democrats on the national stage up there, has his own power base, and really probably will outpoll Stacey Abrams in the AJC poll later on. in a few weeks from now. I mean, I won't be surprised to see his numbers higher than Stacey Abrams right now at this stage, because he hasn't faced, although he was in the middle of the most expensive, U.S. Senate battle in the nation's history, he still hasn't faced the sustained pummeling in the Georgia media and the Georgia TV ads and things like that Stacey Abrams has. So it'll be really fun to watch to see if Senator Warnock can overcome that sort of celebrity factor. If Herschel Walker even is the nominee, and I know things are looking good for him now, but you just never know, and he's such an unpredictable candidate. And just the other day, we reported that his campaign had been lying about the fact that he had graduated from college, because he hadn't. And, just things are coming out. And I know maybe they're not sticking to him in the Republican primary. He might be Teflon Herschel in the Republican primary. We'll see, and maybe they will stick. But in a general election, those things can come back to haunt him as well.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Greg and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, to our listeners for their questions, and to you for being here. If you liked or disliked what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live, where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.